Welcome to the Astro Podcast. Today we have with us Martin Gansten, who is an historian of religion with a specialty on Indic religions. And he has been also doing a lot of research on astrology and the role of astrology in these contexts. So we are here today to talk a little bit about his work. Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad you could join us. What can you tell us about your line of work and your line of research regarding astrology?
Right. Well, as you mentioned, formally I'm a historian of religion. So I've approached astrology from that angle, and of course it's a discussion that frequently comes up is, what has astrology got to do with religion? But then again, for people who approach it from a history of science point of view, it tends to be the same sort of question tends to come up. You know, what has astrology got to do with science? So that's something that you usually have to, start by trying to bridge these two incommensurables, science and religion, which of course are only incommensurable from a modernist point of view. Yeah. So I'm a historian of religion, and as you mentioned, I've also, apart from my study of astrology, my work in astrology, I've also worked on Indic religions generally, and I've taught Sanskrit for a number of years at the University of Copenhagen. So I'm a bit of a philologist and a historian of religion. But my main interest has always been in divination generally, and particularly in astrology, the history of astrology, and its transmission across the globe. Mm-hmm. So I'm particularly interested in the in abolishing this this erroneous idea that there is Indian astrology on the one hand and so-called Western astrology on the other hand, which is simply historically incorrect. So for the past 5 or 6 years, I've been working on the Indian reception of Perso-Arabic astrology, Tajikas. That's been my main focus for some time now. And I'm getting a bit tired of it, so I'm
I remember one of the first things that we talked about, one of the first things that we addressed in our previous conversations was exactly the non-existent difference between Western and Indian astrology, so-called Indian astrology. And that solves the eternal question that people keep asking, which one was the most important, or which one was the source? Like, is it Western astrology deriving from Indian astrology, or the other way around? And this solves the question, like, both are just local differences from the same practice and from the same concept. So yeah, that is solved. That is good. And it was very interesting for us, because we began thinking of astrology as a complete global, so to say, context, and it was very, very, very interesting.
Yes, because I think astrology has been approached, and we have discussed this in previous podcasts with also other scholars, such as Jeffrey Kotick, who's also
our guest,
and we talked about that as well, which is we're talking about a global tradition that then has specific outshoots in regions because of cultural and local adaptations, but instead we're talking about a practice that extends from Europe to the Far East in many variances, and we can see that the same traditions being practiced all over the world, in fact.
And there is a tendency, both among scholars, I would say, and among modern day practitioners, to let the term Western astrology apply to everything outside of India.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, Greek astrology, that's Western. Persian astrology, Western. Egyptian astrology, Western. Arabic language astrology, Western. Everything west of India is Western.
There's a meridian and then it's Western.
Yes. So
yeah.
what I sometimes say is, if we're going to use these distinctions, we should at least have three categories. We might speak of Eastern astrology, that is India, and you know, perhaps perhaps we could include the transmission of horoscopic astrology to East Asia then as well. And Western astrology, we have the Latin transmission from the late Middle Ages. But what we have in the Hellenistic world and the Byzantine and the Persian and Arabic language areas would be better called Central astrology. You know, it's sort of in the middle.
Yeah.
So it's not, you know, it's a very lopsided view to view Indian astrology as the odd man out. It's not.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, Arabic language astrology spread more or less simultaneously from Persia into India, eastwards into India, and westwards into, well, along the northern part of Africa into southern Europe, well, into your part of the world, basically.
Yeah. True. We do have, although, some technical distinctions that perhaps must be taken into account. The one that's more obvious, I think, is the use of sidereal reference system as the sidereal zodiac, while in what we usually call the Western practice, there was an emphasis, at least an emphasis, not an exclusivity, but an emphasis of the tropical zodiac, so the zodiac of the seasons. And I think that is probably, or it has been, the main separation point between these two traditions, because the rest we know that's more or less similar and it's coming from similar roots. But I think, and I would like to hear your opinion on this, this is perhaps the major divide, I would think, that separates, at least from the external point of view, the two traditions, I think.
It's certainly the one that most people know about and think about immediately, you know, when they think about the differences. And it's what tends to cause, you know, for practitioners and for people who are interested on a personal level in astrology and know their own chart placements, or at least their zodiac sign. It tends to cause a crisis of identity, because suddenly, you know, you used to be an Aries and now you're a Pisces, and how do you deal with that? But it's as you say, in the what I would call the Western tradition, that is the Latin language tradition. By that point, it's certainly Western. That has been completely dominated by the tropical zodiac. Which is not to say that there wasn't, for some people, there was a they were aware of the sidereal zodiac. Giuntini, in the, I think, 16th century, has a very interesting passage where he writes about solar returns, solar annual revolutions, and he actually advocates calculating them sidereally. Which is a bit surprising, but you know, by and large, yes, the Western Latin language tradition has been a tropical zodiac tradition.
Yes.
But in the Arabic speaking tradition, the Arabic language texts, it's much more of a varied field, you know, and the earlier authors, the ones who are most influenced by the Persians, they often use sidereal placements, and you find these contradictions. Like Ben Dyke's last year published his annotated translation of Abu Ma'shar's big book on annual revolutions, which in a couple of places explicitly advocates the tropical zodiac, or it advocates the tropical year, rather. But then in other places, in that same work, there are charts that are obviously calculated in the sidereal zodiac. So we get this interesting question: was Abu Ma'shar technically, inconsistent or incompetent? Certainly a possibility. Or, I mean, people did criticize him even during his own lifetime. And Ben Dykes mentions this actually in his introduction, as I recall. Of course, the other possibility is that he didn't write those two sentences advocating the tropical definition of the year, but someone added them at a later point. That's also a possibility. And we've, as far as I know, at present, we have no way of establishing which. But if you, the further back you go, if you look at the texts of Sal and MashaAllah and so on, you find more use of Persian tables, which is to say sidereal tables. And as I said, the Perso-Arabic tradition also made it into India. And the Indians use it sidereally. And it's not that they didn't know about the tropical zodiac, because they did. And the interesting thing is that in a couple of places, they have statements that say something like, oh, and the Romakas, or possibly Romaka as a name, which means the Roman or the Romans, they add precession, which is to say they use the tropical zodiac.
Yeah.
So it seems that they make a distinction between the Romans, which in that era would have meant the Byzantines, and the others. So it's not as clear cut as many people imagine. Indians.
And also, it's not as you mentioned. It's not that they were not aware of it. It's like a choice that they had made.
Yes.
We choose to use the sidereal zodiac, not the tropical zodiac, as the Romakas or what?
Yeah, Romaka, Romans.
Romaka.
And you can, and there's also the discussions about that in the 10th, 11th century, where some tables are made sidereally and not tropical. So gives
interesting. It's quite late.
A doubt, quite late, and in Arabic context. So it does give the doubt exactly what they are using in terms of calculation. And I think the only thing that can answer that, and this has been a constant presence throughout all our conversations in this podcast, is example charts.
Yes.
Would need example charts of a sample of example charts from each of these practices, traditions, regions, etc., and see exactly what they're doing. If we're going to find, do we find a mixed practice? Do we find a more exclusive sidereal or tropical? Or sometimes there's another surprise of something completely different or unexpected. And I think that's probably a way, not the solution, because I doubt that we ever found the absolute solution on this, but at least it can give us more clues how they're dealing with this information.
But this is one of the main goals of the Astro Project, to understand how the techniques and the ideas and the concepts traveled throughout time and throughout the countries. So to see how all this corpus of knowledge that is astrology, how it developed throughout time. So this is one of our main
and it is interesting to also study and to understand how, if we're dealing with two main referentials which are distinct in terms of concept, how do the same techniques or the same concepts, such as dignities, all the divisions, are adapted from one system to the other and vice versa. So how are they applied the same way? Are we talking about a different concept altogether? And I think this is something that has to be looked with detail by academia, and so we can really understand technically what's happening in the practice. And I think this kind of research is valuable as
absolutely
in this understanding this. Yeah, so it's quite an interesting
But
point.
it's not only, as we all know, it's not only about the zodiacs, the difference of the zodiacs. There are other differences. For instance, the so-called Indian astrology gives much importance to the lunar nodes. For instance,
That's right.
they also appear in the so-called Western tradition, but Latin tradition, but they take their own identity in the Indian tradition.
Yeah,
Other things.
they're treated like planets in their own right.
Exactly. It's a different concept altogether. And I was wondering, now that you mentioned the nodes, the distinction between religion and astrology in an Indic context, it's completely different. If there is one, because we are used to seeing astrology in the Western world, where we are and we are speaking, as something that was always has clashed and for centuries with religion, with the established religion, with Christianity, and also with Islam and Judaism, which are the three main ones. There have always been a clash between astrological practice and the existence, the very existence of astrology, mainly with Christianity, I think. But in an Indic context, such clash doesn't exist, or at least doesn't exist in the same way that exists here. So it's something which is completely embedded in the religion, philosophical, mystical tradition. So it doesn't have this clash. So in your sense, as an historian of religion, it should be easier to make the argument of studying astrology from a religious point of view, I would think.
Well, you can make an argument for studying it as a religious phenomenon, even in the West, but when people do that, it tends to fall under what is commonly known as esotericism or esoteric traditions. And then some people try to apply that label to non-European cultures as well, and non-Abrahamic religious contexts, and that gives rise to sort of to strange situation, as you point out, because there's absolutely nothing esoteric about the practice of astrology in India. It's been completely accepted as a valid shastra, that is traditional science or learned discipline, and as you say, it's been completely integrated with religious and philosophical ideas, especially, of course, the completely omnipresent concept of karma, or action, that is action and reaction, which is fundamental to both Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism, and astrology fits very well with the concept of karma, and this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine. I actually think that is one major reason why astrology took root in India to the extent that it did, because astrology does clash with, say, Christianity. I mean, there have been compromises made, and astrology has survived in a Christian context, but there's always been a tension. Because you have this idea about omniscient and omnipotent God, and one God, and it belongs to God alone to know the future and to determine the future. And also, people have to be free, at least their souls have to be free, to make the choice between redemption and sin. So, the stars can't be allowed in Christianity to influence the soul. It might be allowed to influence the body by way of the four humors.
Thomas Aquinas just said it all.
So there's this tension. But in India, there hasn't been that tension, as you rightly pointed out. In fact, you could say that there is a sort of tension inherent in astrology, which the doctrine of karma resolves. Mm-hmm. Because right from the start of horoscopic astrology, as far back as we can follow it, there have been at least two kinds of astrology. There's been natal astrology, or genethliology, where you cast a horoscope and you predict someone's future from it, which presupposes a certain degree of determinism, right?
Yeah.
But then there's also been katarchic astrology, or elections, where you give people advice. You say, do it at this time, not at that time. So that presupposes a certain amount of indeterminism or freedom. And karma is exactly a doctrine that says that, yes, there is a certain framework that is determined for each lifetime. And within that framework, you have free will, free choice, and the choices you make will determine the framework for your next life. Mm-hmm. So it fits very well with astrology, really. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one reason why it's become so, as I said, so widespread and firmly rooted in India.
Exactly.
Yeah. This tension that you mentioned, it is, well, in Christianity, is between the will of God or the licitude of astrology, the question whether astrology can be done, can be practiced, or if God is against it somehow. And there are lots of interesting replies to this from astrologers, from medieval astrologers and so on. But when we come to a non-monotheistic religion, part of this tension disappears, as you just said, but there's always this internal, tension and also utility in astrology, that is, we can predict somehow, and because we can predict, we can change, at least within some parameters, because just as you just said, we have natal astrology, and we can more or less have an idea of the person, and then there are other practices, namely the so-called elections,
that manage
the future, so to say. So this is something that is on the one hand is the very internal tension of astrology, but also its utility. I mean, its social utility. People could use it as a tool for prediction and for changing within certain parameters. And that is, I suppose, more free and more useful in non-monotheistic religions. At least this is the idea I get. I don't know if you agree with me.
Possibly, yes. I mean, one particular aspect of electional astrology, or one particular use of electional astrology, has been traditionally astrological magic, which has been very much a gray area, if not entirely,
Well, dark gray, really dark gray. Yeah.
If not exactly in the black arts. Whereas in India, it's just, a ritual is a ritual.
Yeah.
And if whether you worship the planetary deities or some other deity, it doesn't really matter. A deity is a deity.
Yes.
And it is very much alive. When I was in London for my PhD, I had some colleagues in my residence who were practicing Hindus. And we had the opportunity to talk, and it's something that is a completely normal part of their everyday life, this practice. I don't mean astrology, I mean religion. And dealing with these different concepts of deity. perfectly alive, not just in medieval times.
Yeah, because it's
no.
something that for the Western mentality,
it's kind of difficult.
it's kind of way in a forgotten past, in which we had the Greek Roman, for probably with the last instance of great civilization that had polytheism, and we've lost it for millennia now. And
so Western people tend to think that for other people this is also something from the past, but it isn't. It's kind of a everyday life. So
which makes the context and the perception of things completely different.
Specifically astrology, yes.
We were also talking with Jeffrey Kotick in a previous podcast about the fact that, for example, our concept of astrology in the West, the Latin tradition is much connected with Aristotle's and the way Aristotle thought the world worked, and which is prevalent during centuries, which is something that in other contexts it's non-existent. So that although some concepts might be present, like the elements or other similar descriptors part, there isn't that hard core of Aristotelianism that supports or explains astrology, and so there is a lot more freedom to accept certain practices or to be more at ease with certain practices and certain connections within astrology that don't necessarily have to be explained scientifically in the sense that Aristotelianism is a sort of natural science explanation for astrology.
So there's more freedom.
Yeah. Do you see that as well in your view, in your study of Hinduism and its connection to astrology?
Do I see the absence of Aristotelianism as
as an advantage, so to say,
at least an advantage, or at least a more free way of looking at how this knowledge works without having to constantly explain it and refer to or support it with arguments that are from a system which is outside astrology itself. For example, here we have the idea of the influence, so the causes, celestial causes that influence behavior. While in other contexts, there are still the same methods of interpretation, the same connections, the same qualities being applied, but there isn't this concept.
At least
not in this way, not expressed in this way.
Yeah. I understand what you're asking. And this is one of the interesting things about, from a history of religion's point of view, this is one of the interesting things about studying the transmission of astrology, because, as you say, very much the same practices, the same symbolic language, the same techniques, same sorts of interpretations are applied, but they are embedded within very different worldviews, including different conceptions of deity and different conceptions of reality, really. And of course, as I said, in the Indian context, it's at a very early stage. Actually, as far as I know, in the very earliest preserved Sanskrit texts on astrology, there is this explicit linking of astrology with karma. So some people, there was an German Indologist named Halpfas, for instance, who argued that, well, originally there must have been sort of tension or clash between the model of astrology and the explanatory model of astrology and that of karma. But I'm not sure there was. I mean, I'd like to see some hard textual evidence of that. Because right from the very earliest preserved Sanskrit texts on astrology, we have this, as I said, this explicit invocation of karma. And once you have that, you don't really need to explain how it works. It's just, it works by karma. And then different schools of philosophy and different religious traditions will have slightly different ideas about how karma works. But that's, some people will think, like the Jains, they view karma as, more or less as a mechanism that exists by itself, that doesn't need anything else to prop it up, so to speak. Whereas the more theistically inclined traditions say that, well, God, the supreme God, sort of is the guarantor of karma. There is a supreme deity who makes sure that the law of karma works, keeps everything rolling, just like he, she, it keeps the whole universe working. And of course, there are several traditions that are explicitly idealist in their worldview. They work from a consciousness-only model. And of course, once you look at it from that angle, then everything sort of changes a bit. The way you view karma, the way you view astrology, etc. So they all have their different takes on karma, but astrology sort of just goes along with that. However karma works, that's how astrology works.
That is a concept. The concept of karma is also, in my view, it's very misunderstood in the West. And some people, at least in the West, contemporary people, kind of mix the concept of karma with the
concept of punishment,
sin and
which
punishment.
has much more.
So it's kind of a very toxic marriage between these two.
The strange mixture, which
it's karma viewed through the lens of Christianity.
Exactly, very toxic relationship. So they think when they hear the word karma, they think of punishment in some way, and it's not that. It's like natural consequences. From what I can understand, natural consequences, either good or bad or neutral, from action.
That's the idea. As you think and as you act, so you become, and not just you, but your experience. That is the happiness or misery that you experience. So then that's the basic idea. And I think everyone, all the different schools would agree on that definition. So.
I'm curious, and now changing a little bit the topic. Can you give us, I know you cannot talk about everything if you have researched so far, but what would be for you interesting highlights of this reception which you're studying that you think that are interesting or at least are central to your research work, or are outstanding in some way among all of your research?
Maybe it's difficult to maybe.
Perhaps a difficult question. Yes.
Are we talking specifically about the reception of Arabic language astrology or further back? Okay.
Yeah. Well, let me know. You're the expert. What
is more relevant for you?
Okay. Well, to give a very broad sort of idea, you can say that astrology in India has three distinct strata or layers to it. So first there's the indigenous astral divination. That is not horoscopic astrology, but we have the asterisms, the nakshatras, constellations, and the sun and the moon, and they were used for calendaric purposes, and this calendar was used not just for practical purposes, but also for ritual purposes to determine auspicious times for religious rituals and so on. And eventually it was also used for personal divination. That's at the earliest stage, before horoscopic astrology enters India. But then you get horoscopic astrology coming into India in two distinct waves, with about a millennium between them. So first, Greek language astrology, and then about 1,000 years later, Arabic language astrology, which of course in itself was also derived ultimately from Greek language astrology. So, but you get these two waves, and they form two separate schools of astrology in India. That is, the Greek language astrology that entered was made very Indian in character quite quickly. It was assimilated and adapted to Indian society and Indian ideas, so that this fact that it was actually of non-Indian origin was quite quickly forgotten. And then when the Arabic language astrology was imported, that was seen as foreign, whereas the older astrology was seen as indigenous. And so they weren't mixed, they weren't merged, but they were practiced side by side, sometimes by the same people. So, for instance, there's one author whose huge work I've been editing and translating for the past 5 or 6 years now, and just finished. He wrote an equally big book 5 years later. So his first big book was on Sanskritized Arabic astrology, Perso-Arabic astrology. But then he wrote a book on traditional Indian astrology, that is the kind that actually has Greek roots. So he wrote one book in each, rather than mixing them.
Yes. So for them, it was a completely different.
It's sufficiently different for it to be. It would be difficult to merge them. You would have to make different decisions, like what aspect system should we use, because Indian astrology developed their own take on aspects, and then they got the more original Greek version passed on through the Arabic language authors, and they had two different models there, and also different. Well, all kinds of technical differences. we shouldn't get into too much detail.
Yeah, okay.
They had to choose. I have a question that is also related to these three lines of tradition, so to say, the three things. I think we had this conversation before, but Luis, as you know, is studying the Jesuits and the way they dealt with astrology in different parts of the world. And one of the things that we find interesting, I don't know if you agree, is that when it comes to China, they have a lot of translation. There's a lot of translation going on from Chinese to Portuguese, or I think Latin, and from Portuguese and Latin into Chinese. When we come to China, when we come to India, we don't find that many.
Exactly.
So they were. My question is, they were open to the Greek and Arabic waves, but at a certain point, when we come to the 17th century, they are not open to any more Western foreign people coming with new ideas.
Adding a little bit to Elena's question, what I found, and we've discussed this on other conversations before, I cannot see at least no academic work so far that explicitly addresses this, is what is the reception of Western Latin astrology coming from the 16th and 17th century exchange that is growing on in India, and also I cannot find vice versa some sort of reception of Indian astrology, so that the astrology that is practiced in India in the West.
And yet there were intensive cultural exchanges.
Yeah, and it is strange for me because we are seeing two cultures that have a practice of astrology quite embedded in even with the religious problems that we discuss in the West, but still there is a practice that is embedded in both civilizations, and yet I was expecting to see a much more argumentation and going back and forth how it works, who's right, who's wrong, the usual. But there appears to be very little of this discussion.
It's like two parallel lines.
Yeah, or at least it's still to be studied. I don't know. But that was something that I found very strange. While, as Elena pointed out, in China and Japan, you can see the exchange going on and existing. I don't know.
What is your opinion?
What's your opinion? Because I believe that there is another wave, more recent, I would think, of when Western practices go into India and vice versa, because we also have the Indian practices then coming into the West in, of course, more contemporary dates. But what do you know about that?
What do you think about the 17th century?
It's a bit off your timeline.
Quite a bit. It's quite a bit.
Actually, it's bang on my timeline, because this book I just finished editing and translating, it was written in 1649.
Oh,
okay.
in the Mughal, in the regional capital of the Mughal province of Bengal, in East India. And your observation is spot on. When Perso-Arabic astrology, sometimes I use the term Perso-Arabic, sometimes I say Arabic language astrology. All the textual sources were in Arabic, as far as we can see. But of course, this early Arabic astrology was very much influenced by Persian astrology, and it was probably brought to India by people who were Persians by ethnicity. So Perso-Arabic. This Perso-Arabic astrology entered India, or began to enter India during a period when there was quite large openness. People were very open towards, or comparatively speaking, for India, they were quite open to external influences. But over the next few centuries, and this is a bit of speculation, but I think there is a causal connection here, as Muslim dominance of India increased, there was a sort of a process where the learned communities, Sanskrit language learned communities, sort of closed more and more the door towards other kinds of influences, and you can actually see that in the earliest preserved Tajika texts, that is these Sanskrit texts on Perso-Arabic astrology. They just say, when they start writing about it, they say, well, here's something interesting. This is a new thing we've found. It's called Tajika, which means Persian astrology. There are no apologetics. They don't feel the need to defend themselves. But in the later works, in the 16th and 17th centuries, those authors actually begin their works by stating why it is permissible to study this. Is it really permissible? What would be the arguments against? What would be the arguments in favor? And of course, they always end up by concluding that it is permissible, because otherwise they wouldn't be writing the book. But they feel the need of apologetics.
Okay.
And this goes very well with the idea that I've seen presented by Professor Sheldon Pollock at Columbia, I think it is, who writes that there was I can't quote him verbatim from memory, but he says that towards I think he says the 17th century, there was a wave of neo-traditionalism that took over in India, where there had been quite a lot of innovation over the past few centuries, but now suddenly everything was to be very traditional. And I think that is probably a reaction to perceived external threats. I mean, these things usually are, as indeed we can see today.
Yes.
Let me see, so that I don't lose the thread here.
So this would be made more difficult to than Western
yes.
ideas.
Penetrate.
If we broaden the scope a bit and look not just to astrology, but for instance, in the realm of religion and philosophy, Indian tradition has always been very polemical. There's been a lot of freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, lots and lots of different schools. They didn't burn heretics at the stake in India.
It was difficult to find an heretic in this context.
Al-Biruni, the Persian polymath in the 11th century, who traveled widely in India and wrote a book about India in Arabic. He notes at some point in that book, he notes with surprise that he says, although there are all these different religious and philosophical schools, they don't wage war on each other, or if they do, it's only by words. So they had this tradition of intellectual debate and polemics.
And diversity.
Sorry?
And diversity.
Yes, and diversity.
Yes.
So, but if you were to form an idea just from these works written in Sanskrit up to the 17th and even 18th century, of what religious traditions there were in India, you would never guess that there was Islam, there was Christianity, there was even a bit of Judaism, and so on. These traditions are simply not mentioned. The polemics and the debates and the discussions are all within the Indic schools, the ones that arose in India. And the way they deal with foreign influences is simply not to deal with them, just to leave them out.
Ignore them and they will eventually go away.
Something like that. Not necessarily go away, but
don't reply to them.
And when it comes to astrology in particular, as you said, Louise, by the time the Europeans started arriving in large numbers, the scholarly communities, the Sanskrit-speaking scholarly communities were largely closed to foreign influences. And it wasn't until the 19th century, even late 19th century, that things began to change a bit. And at that point, it still wasn't the Sanskrit language communities, the traditional families of astrologers, because it was a hereditary thing as a rule. It wasn't those people that started a dialogue with Western astrology, but rather you got the Theosophical Society coming into India and opening their headquarters there in just outside Chennai, or Madras as it was called, and they were very interested in all sorts of aspects of Indian religion and learning, including astrology, and they managed to get a few pundits, a few scholars, traditional scholars, to translate a few texts for them. But really, it wouldn't have taken off, I think, if it hadn't been for the invention of the printing press or bringing of printing technology into India, which made it possible suddenly to distribute books on a large scale. That the printing technology and the railway, those two things together made it possible suddenly to translate and print books in large numbers and then distribute them across the country. And once that has started, it just kept on rolling. The snowball kept growing and growing.
Yeah. That's quite interesting, yes, because that puts the interaction between Indian, the culture, the traditions of Indian astrology and Western astrology to a much, much later date, where astrology in the West has already a completely different context, and a different incorporation into the cultural background, which is quite interesting. Because that's interesting. That's quite interesting, because. That's, as I said before, there's always something that amazed me is why wasn't this interchange going on? Even if just to criticize, they could be saying horrible things about Indian astrology and vice versa, but
they don't.
Not at least not with detail or in the view of someone that's studied, read material, and is making an educated criticism. It's just that general criticism of religious, which is coming from a religious point of view more than anything else. Which then would be explained, the lack of that, because the interaction is occurring much later, almost 300 years later.
Yes.
Okay.
Or at least 200 to 250 years later.
250 years.
And as I mentioned, I just want to clarify this. Most of the people who started translating, because the theosophists themselves, these Europeans, British and of other nationalities, they didn't know any Sanskrit, so they had to have local people translate the texts for them. But most of these people who did the translations and then started to write books of their own on astrology, on Indian astrology, they were not from these traditional astrological families. So they were not professional astrologers. They had other professions. They were civil servants, lawyers, things like that. People who had a good English education. They were fluent in English, but they also had enough of a traditional education to know, sometimes barely, but they knew some Sanskrit, just enough to make some translations.
Okay, so they're looking at things in a very superficial way, that they're not able to go in depth.
Also from Western filters.
Yes, absolutely.
The problem with these things is because we are also guilty of this. We all try to fit the new ideas into whatever we already know, in whatever mental categories we already have. So sometimes it is difficult, and
sometimes you need to unlearn things, and that can be very hard.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes. What a difficult task. Okay.
We look forward to your book.
Yes, we look forward to your book, and perhaps that's something we can discuss in detail in a future podcast as soon as it's launched. From what we understood, it's a big book, and as you said, it synthesizes, or at least it's a primer of the Arabic Hindu interaction, so that tradition where the Arabic line of astrology enters Hinduism and interacts with it.
Yes.
And I'm sure it will answer a lot of our questions, because it is the interface of these two. It's an example of the interface of these two completely strong and mature cultures interacting regarding astrology.
Yeah.
So I would invite Martin
Yes.
to another podcast.
Yeah, another podcast as soon as
Regarding
the book comes out, and we'll discuss it with more detail, and perhaps we can revisit all these topics
with the book.
With
Yes,
the book,
within
I
the
think that
context.
would be quite interesting.
Do you know
to
when
do.
it will be?
The preliminary date is 20th August, so it will be in a couple of months. It should be out there.
Oh, so
Okay,
it will be
okay.
soon.
Just
Great.
I'm just working with on the index right now, which is
that is that's part is the difficult part.
Yeah, the hard part.
Because you already
hard work.
Yes, you already done everything, and then you have to go to the index. Yes, now it is a difficult part. Well, we look forward to it.
Yeah, we will look forward to it. Thank you very much for
all this,
yes. and to come to the podcast. We hope to have you more times in the future to discuss again the invitation, not only the book, but any particular points in your research
that you find
interesting to share and to talk a little bit about. That would be quite interesting.
And we say goodbye for now.
Yeah, we say goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.